The Catlick live finale is less than 2 weeks away, and it's currently 80% sold out. Don't miss out. It's all going down the weekend of March the 14th. Get your tickets right now at catlick.com or wait till the end of this episode to hear more updates. All right, enjoy. It's July of 1914, month number 43 of our story. Striker Henry Grenuff steps onto the stage in the auditorium of the Odd Fellows building, less than a mile from the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. It's the daily meeting of strikers. Henry is the union's song leader, and it's his job to lift the spirits of the striking workers through music. Onward, Christian Soldiers is a crowd favorite. Henry Grenuff, originally from England, worked as a singer before falling on hard times. He'd come to Atlanta a few weeks earlier looking for work, and he eventually found himself in the recruitment office at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills. He was quickly hired. Henry had worked in mills before, so he didn't need much training. As a loom fixer, his job kept him moving to different parts of the mill throughout the day. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for strikers to begin targeting the new Fulton Bag worker, selling him hard on joining their cause. And eventually, their pitch worked. Shortly after starting, he signed a union membership roster and walked out of the mill for good. In the following days, Henry Grenuff took his place on the picket lines with the others, but it was at the daily union meetings where Henry began to stand out. Someone noticed the newcomer's beautiful tenor voice during the daily singing and suggested he become the group's new song leader. The offer was made, and Henry agreed. The strike leaders quickly fell in love with Henry Grenuff because, well, there was lots to love. While most of the strikers were unreliable, impulsive, and just generally rough around the edges, Henry was the opposite. He was dependable, well-spoken, and charming. After a few weeks as the union song leader, they asked if he would be willing to speak at an upcoming rally. Once again, he agreed. On July the 9th, hundreds of strikers packed the floors of the Oddfellows Auditorium. With his head held high, Henry strode to center stage and began to boom. The passionate Englishman was a natural. With the fire and gusto of an old-time preacher, he implored them to keep the faith, stay the course, and most importantly, show up for the daily pickets. Henry Grenuff was a rising star. The strike had been going now for a month and a half, so strike leadership was thankful for a new face and voice. A graceful crooner with a gift for speaking was just what they needed to breathe some new life into the movement. However, there was one small problem. Henry Grenuff wasn't Henry Grenuff. Henry Grenuff's real name was Harry Preston, and he wasn't a legit striker or a union sympathizer. Harry Preston was a mole, a spy, a phony, and a con man. Known in the Vault archives simply as operative number 115. As the most skilled undercover agent at the Railway Audit and Inspection Company, he was sent to Atlanta with a very specific mission: infiltrate the ranks of strike leadership and sow seeds of chaos. By day, Harry Preston worked the picket lines and led union singings. But at night, he snuck away to his quarters and secretly typed out his daily report, feeding a constant stream of insider information directly to Oscar Elsas. With his super spy in place, Elsas was prepared to destroy the strike from the inside out. You're listening to episode 20 of Catlick, the Super Spy. the summer of 1914, Atlanta was bubbling over with various kinds of drama. Leo Frank was still imprisoned down at the Fulton Tower, with his fate still in question. In June, his legal team lost yet another appeal when a lower court, once again, refused to nullify the original verdict. Refusing to give up, they began to work other angles. Meanwhile, Tom Watson had launched a brutal smear campaign against Leo Frank. Tom Watson is one of the more notorious personalities in Atlanta history. In the late 1800s, he was a progressive voice in Georgia politics. He became a U.S. Senator and was at one time the vice president candidate on the Democratic ticket. However, later in life, Tom Watson morphed into a darker and more sinister political force. Law professor Jonathan Turley describes him as being, quote, one of the nation's most rabid, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, and racist leaders. Tom Watson ran a private newspaper called the Jeffersonian, and for whatever reason, he became obsessed with Leo Frank and used the Jeffersonian as his megaphone. The flame of anti-Semitism that had burned during the trial of Leo Frank was now being stoked and fueled by Tom Watson. Here are just a few of the things Tom Watson called Leo Frank. A rich, depraved sodomite Jew. A foul degenerate. A filthy and murderous sodomite. A satyr-faced New York Jew. And a lustful beast. Tom Watson played up every prejudice, every fear, every inner hatred that existed in the South, and Leo Frank had become the focus of his rage. Throughout the summer of 1914, the courts were still hearing the Leo Frank appeals, but the court of public opinion was turning more on Frank each day, and the pressure was building. Across town, Oscar Elsas read Watson's comments dripping with anti-Jewish hate with increasing despair. This only convinced him further that his own workers and all of Atlanta more broadly were out to get him. His urgency to crush the strike only grew. Early in their working relationship, Oscar Elsas established a line of two-way communication with his top undercover informant, Harry Preston. By the way, you can read several of Harry Preston's reports posted inside the vault. What really made Harry Preston next level were his skills not as an informant, but as a provocateur. As an agent of corporate espionage, it's not hard to report to the boss what you're seeing out in the field. So-and-so did this person said that. It takes a much more deft hand to seed propaganda, to bend the views of others in a direction favorable towards management. This is what the elite operatives like Harry Preston did so masterfully. They were master manipulators of the human will. Preston's strategy was simple. Get close to strike leadership, earn their trust, and then, very gently, begin to manipulate. In his early reports, Preston's analysis of what was happening behind the scenes of the Union was pure gold for Oscar Elsas. One of his first bits of intel was in regards to their strategy. This is what he observed. Their entire plan of campaign is centered on the church people and the business people, getting their sympathy and support. This was just the beginning. He had thoughts pretty much on everything. He visited the commissary and reported that it was, quote, stinkingly, filthily rotten, end quote. Adding that the floors of the commissary were disgusting, both from men spitting tobacco and children relieving themselves. He reported on the local union president, William Fleming, writing this. Fleming tried to imitate some of the speakers he heard yesterday and succeeded in making an ass of himself. A long, rambling speech, saying much and meaning nothing. I cannot see how Fleming could influence anyone. He is disgusting in appearance and manners, dirty and uncouth, mouth full of tobacco at all times and turning around to expectorate every little while as he talks. Splendid specimen of a leader. Harry Preston was especially critical of the strike's two female leaders, Ola Delight Smith and Sarah Conboy. He felt both of them were highly unladylike, and his thoughts on them were unashamedly sexist, often characterizing them as unhinged, hysterical, and shrieky. In 1914, women in the South were expected to be quiet and compliant. Conboy and Smith were anything but. Preston also reported to Elsas regarding rumors that strike leaders Ola Delight Smith and Charles Miles were engaged in an inappropriate relationship. In response, Elsas assigned 2 spies to follow both of them wherever they went. Harry Preston also identified a subtle but growing rift between the strike's 2 original leaders, Ola Smith and Charles Miles, and the 2 new leaders, Sarah Conboy and Mary Keller. In private meetings with them, Harry Preston antagonized their differences, hoping to seed more and more distrust between the 2 pairs of rivals. Preston also seized on the growing number of people leeching off the commissary. By July, 1,600 people were being fed at the enormous cost of $1,000 per week. At strike meetings, leaders were constantly chastising those who wanted to live off the commissary but not participate in pickets. Preston saw an opportunity. He wrote to Elsas, "I have been quietly agitating this for several days, by talking to a number of sensible people and showing them where these bums were getting more than their share of provisions." Once again, Harry Preston identified a vulnerability and started poking at it, always knowing just how far he could push without blowing his cover. If he could keep the strike leaders in a constant state of exasperation, they'd eventually get discouraged, give up, and go home. As the summer unfolded, the Men and Religion Forward movement increased their pressure on Oscar Elsas. You may remember that's the group of religious and business leaders working to vanquish Atlanta of its vice, child labor, and evil business practices. They also hosted that big rally at the end of June, which drew 2,000 people. Well, in July, the MRFM sent a telegram to Washington, D.C., both to the U.S. Secretary of Labor and President Woodrow Wilson. They requested that Washington send someone down to investigate the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill for its labor practices. This was a major escalation by the Men and Religion Forward movement. Well, the telegram did not fall on deaf ears, and within a couple of weeks, several federal investigators arrived in Atlanta. One of those investigators was a woman by the name of Ines Weed. Now, Ines Weed was a bit of a sneak herself, and tracking her activities once she got to Atlanta is a bit tricky. Nevertheless, here's what we know. When she got to Atlanta, Ines Weed immediately scheduled a meeting with Oscar Elsas. But instead of identifying herself as a government investigator, she told him she was a journalist writing a magazine article on Southern textile mills. Weed was a smooth talker, and she pitched her article in a way that garnered Oscar's trust. In reality, however, Ines Weed was a labor activist with major sympathies for the Southern labor movement and no love for millionaire mill owners like Oscar. Shockingly, Oscar Elsas took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. He agreed to an interview and got uncharacteristically candid with Ines Weed. Here are the highlights. For one, Elsas admitted that dealing with the strike had been completely exhausting. He said he'd been getting up at 5 a.m. for the last 10 weeks to put in the extra hours to deal with it. They also talked about other things, including the transient nature of his workers, as well as his PR strategy. But once she got him loosened up, she laid her trap. Towards the end of the interview, Ines Weed referenced another strike that had happened up in Michigan and how that particular company hired a strike-breaking agency that shut down that strike with one simple tactic: violence. That's the setup. Here's their exchange, word for word. Once again, this is Ina Swede sitting across the table from Oscar Elsas, interviewing him for a supposed magazine article. The strike-breaking agency had 11 of the leaders in the hospital in a week, and the strike was ended. Elsas cuts her off. Oh, I'd like to do that. I don't want to use such methods, though, on women and children. But in an acute situation where I only had men to deal with, I'd just as soon get guns and mow them down. Boom. She caught him. Here was Oscar Elsas on the record saying that if it was just men striking, he'd prefer to kill them all and move on. This is completely crazy. So I can't imagine Oscar's horror when he opened the newspapers the next day and saw his comments about gunning down strikers in print for the whole town to see. He knew he'd been had. And Ina Swede? She was already on a train headed out of town. July, however, wasn't all bad for Oscar Elsas. Harry Preston reported that Mary Keller and Sarah Conboy, who'd only been around for a month, had been recalled. Oddly, the United Textile Workers Association, based out of New York, reassigned them to another project. In his reports to Elsas, Preston called this a, quote, very serious blow to the union, end quote. Going on to explain his belief that Sarah Conboy was by far the most competent of the four main strike leaders. With Conboy and Keller now gone, Harry Preston's value only increased. Another federal investigator arrived a few days later, and Preston himself intercepted him at the train station. They spent the day together, chatting, chuckling, and discussing the fact that they were both Masons. Preston laid the charm on thick, but then spent the rest of their time together discrediting the strike and its leaders. The investigator bought it fully, eventually reporting back that the strike was crumbling and that the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill really wasn't as bad as previously reported. Oscar's super spy had struck again. At the beginning of August, the provocation in Europe, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, finally boiled over into war. On August the 4th, World War I was officially underway when German forces invaded Belgium. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Oscar Elsas was waging a war of his own, this time against the Men and Religion Forward Movement and its leaders. Week after week, the MRFM published giant bulletins in the Atlanta papers denouncing the mill and its labor practices. Oscar was not happy about this, and at one point, he called the preachers of the Men and Religion Forward movement a, quote, pack of meddling idiots, end quote. His talk, however, quickly turned to action. His first move was to dispatch the services of his super spy, Harry Preston. He tasked Preston with infiltrating the MRFM leadership team, just as he'd done with the unions. Within days, Preston was in. Once again, he charmed them with song. As an established strike leader, they instantly trusted him and swiftly appointed him as the song leader for the Men and Religion Forward movement. With this new position of influence, he was able to curry lots of favor with the movement's leaders. He could now begin a new disinformation campaign there, with the goal of discrediting the strike and urging the MRFM to move on to bigger things. Oscar Elsas's most aggressive tactic at taking down the Men and Religion Forward movement was directed at John Egan, the group's president. John Egan was a successful Atlanta businessman who was the chief stakeholder in a steel mill in Birmingham, Alabama. Oscar Elsas, along with his brother Benjamin, reached out to contacts in Birmingham to do a little snooping around Egan's factory. Sure enough, they found exactly what they were looking for: As it turns out, Egan's factory wasn't exactly the paragon of virtue. With filthy working conditions, a deplorable mill village, and even child labor, it was obvious that Egan was guilty of some of the same sins he'd condemned Oscar Elsas for. When his contacts in Birmingham reported back, Elsas moved quickly, taking a page out of the Ola Delight Smith propaganda handbook. He hired his own professional photographer in Birmingham, as well as local operatives, tasked with tracking down workers in Egan's factory and securing sworn affidavits regarding their pay, conditions in the mill village, etc. Days later, Oscar Elsas had just what he needed. Images of dirty children working in Birmingham slaving away on the backdrop of a grimy, smoke-filled factory. With photos now in hand, Oscar Elsas reached out to a member of the MRFM, George Muse. He demanded to meet with the executive committee as soon as possible. Just a few days later, Oscar Elsas walked into a conference room on the top floor of George Muse's department store in downtown Atlanta. Seated before him, the executive committee of the Men in Religion Forward Movement. Elsas reached into his briefcase and removed a folder. He opened it up and spread out a series of photographs and sworn affidavits concerning John Egan's Birmingham steel mill. What was said next comes to us from Norman Elsas, Oscar's son. Many years later, he retold this story as it had been told to him by his father. These are his words. Dad said, "I don't want anything published regarding the Fulton Mill or I'll move from Atlanta." And then one of the men said something, and Dad pulled a gun out of his pocket and laid it on the table. And he said, "I'm going to leave this room, or some of you are going to leave with me dead. I want no more advertisements from the Men in Religion Forward Movement telling lies about the Elsas family or the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill." Spies, blackmail, and now guns. Oscar Elsas was not playing around. Well, his big boy move with the pistol on the table must have worked. After August, the MRFM bulletins quietly disappeared from the pages of the Atlanta papers, and the organization shifted its focus elsewhere. Through straight-up blackmail and the sly manipulations of Harry Preston, Oscar Elsas had successfully gotten the Men in Religion Forward Movement off of his back. By late August, the strike was struggling. With two of its top leaders now gone, they took another hit when one of their chief funding sources dried up. The Atlanta Federation of Trades had been a major contributor to the commissary. They'd taken on considerable debt to fund the Fulton strike and informed Miles and Smith that they were out. The two remaining strike leaders weren't about to give up. Oh no. They concocted a dramatic plan that would save lots of money and hopefully save the strike. One of the biggest costs of the union was subsidizing rent for the strikers. They'd been shelling out tons of cash to private boarding houses around the mill, but their new plan would eliminate that cost. What was that plan? I'll tell you. To construct a tent city. When Miles and Smith announced the creation of a new tent colony, they also announced that they were shuttering the commissary. This, too, was a cost-saving measure. To discourage people from leeching off the commissary, Charles Miles introduced a new rule. Only those who lived in the tent city would receive rations from the union, and everyone would eat together in one huge tent that would act as a mess hall. Well, this announcement was met with mixed reviews amongst the strikers, and several of them chose to return to work. Nevertheless, the plan moved forward. A small sea of white tents began to rise on a plot of land just west of the cotton mill. The early days in the union's tent colony were pretty awful. When the first big rain came, many of the tents collapsed, soaking the strikers and all their meager belongings. With no system to handle garbage or sanitation, the grounds got really nasty really fast, and over time, prostitutes began sneaking into the camp under cover of night. Within just a few days, the strikers' hopeful new tent city was looking an awful lot like the Mill Village hell they were used to. Guess who was right in the middle of all the tent city drama? Yep, Harry Preston. From day one, he kept Oscar Elsas closely apprised of everything happening in the camp. He informed Elsas that the Union secretary had acquired a, quote, loathsome transmittable disease, and had been spreading it amongst many of the loose women in the camp. Preston was the ultimate pot stirrer. He spread rumors of STDs and prostitutes running rampant in the camp. He shared lurid tales of corruption, that Ola Delight Smith herself had stolen funds from the Union coffers. To those outside the camp, he portrayed it as a place of filth, debauchery, and moral turpitude, knowing that if he could make the rumors stick, it would keep new workers from joining the strike while also dissolving pity from outsiders. Meanwhile, strike leadership used the camp to stir up a new wave of publicity, knowing that bedraggled mill workers standing in front of dilapidated tents would draw some much-needed sympathy and hopefully re-energize the strike. They spoke with local and national pro-union publications and gushed about the, quote, beauties and healthfulness of camp life, end quote. An article in the Textile Worker magazine had this to say. The strikers say they have never felt better in their lives than they do now that their existence is pitched in the open air with wholesome food and healthful work. Yeah, right. Strike leaders were always fudging the numbers of how many strikers were living in the tent city. At one point, they claimed that there were 300 workers living there in perfect harmony. Well, that was certainly a lie. It was never that many. Building on the success of Eviction Day, Ola Delight Smith commissioned yet another set of photos to be produced. But this time, it was all about life in the tent city. FYI, we've got lots of these photos posted in the vault. However, Ola Delight Smith, ever the opportunist or propagandist, depending on who you ask, well, she wasn't totally honest with her documentary photography campaign. It was in the 1980s when some of Ola's strike images were discovered at a facility in Maryland. 70 years earlier, the strike leaders had compiled their photos in a couple of scrapbooks. That's where the photos of the evictions and the tent city ended up. Well, in the 1980s, a couple of astute researchers noticed a particularly odd-looking photo in one of those scrapbooks. It was a big panoramic group shot of all the strikers standing in front of their tents. But when they looked at the image more closely, they noticed something. The people on the left side of the photo were also on the right side of the photo. Ola Delight Smith had created her own fake news. Somehow she created a composite image of two separate photos with the clear goal of making the group of strikers look twice as big as it actually was. Once again, amazing. Before Photoshop, Ola Delight Smith was out here doctoring photos, deceiving folks into thinking that everything was hunky-dory down in Strikeland. Ever the hustler, that Ola Delight Smith. By late September, Harry Preston was flying high. With rumors that the local union president was on the brink of resigning, several strikers asked him if he'd be willing to step into that role. Did you catch that? They asked one of Oscar Elsas's undercover informants to become the president of the union. Unbelievable. At the same time, Harry Preston quietly created a petition denouncing the leadership of Charles Miles and Ola Delight Smith. He secured signatures from 45 strikers. His communications to Oscar Elsas during this time reflected his growing confidence. He was sure the strike would collapse any day now, telling Elsas that all that remained was a, quote, collection of misled, ignorant creatures, some fools, some thieves, all without good sense, end quote. Later that fall, major drama hit the tent colony when two men got into a drunken fight. Things escalated, a knife came out, and one of the men, Pat Callahan, was stabbed. Strangely, Ola Delight Smith invited the wounded Pat Callahan to move into her home so she could tend to him as he recovered. The only thing that made this arrangement awkward was that Ola was a married woman. Her husband, Edgar, reluctantly agreed. Pat Callahan stayed with the Smiths for several weeks and eventually healed up. Slightly annoyed at the man's extended stay, Ola's husband eventually informed him that it was his time to move along. Well, Ola was having none of that. Amazingly, she sided with Pat Callahan, arguing to her husband that he should be allowed to stay with them as long as he wanted. Edgar, understandably upset, flipped out on Ola and stormed out of the house. He eventually left town altogether. When word of this incident spread throughout the camp, Harry Preston watched closely. He noticed a marked change in Ola Delight Smith after her husband left town. It was like the life had been sucked out of her. In his daily report, he wrote to Oscar, "The cocky walk and actions she used to have are all gone, and now she walks around like a smacked ass." This was the beginning of the end for the strike's biggest personality. In early October, as the strikers got used to tent colony life, there was big news breaking with the Leo Frank case. You'll remember that back during the trial of Leo Frank, which had taken place a full year earlier, Hugh Dorsey had been the lead attorney for the prosecution. There was another attorney, however, named William Smith. You'll remember William Smith as Jim Conley's personal lawyer. Jim Conley was the black sweeper of the National Pencil Factory. Leo Frank's attorneys argued that it was Conley alone who'd killed Mary Fagan. But Conley testified that Frank had killed her and then bribed him to dispose of the body. The jury, of course, believed Conley's testimony and sentenced Leo Frank to death. You may also remember that I mentioned that William Smith was quite unusual for his time and that he was a white attorney who'd spent most of his career defending poor black people around Atlanta, people he genuinely believed were innocent. That any white lawyer would take up their causes voluntarily made William Smith quite weird during his day and quite noble during ours. Well, on October the 4th, the newspapers dropped a hell of a bomb. William Smith had come to believe that Leo Frank was innocent and that his client, Jim Conley, was the real murderer of Mary Fagan. Apparently, in the year that had passed since the trial, William Smith couldn't quit thinking about the case. Instead of moving on, he became obsessed with it. With the help of his wife, he'd spent countless hours researching the particulars of the case, often poring over the thousands of pages of trial transcripts late into the night. And in that research, he'd come to one inconvenient conclusion. Leo Frank was innocent. When Smith came forward with his revelation, he released a lengthy statement of reasons that he'd changed his mind. And there were lots of them. He began by saying that before and during the trial, he'd caught Jim Conley in countless lies. He actually created his own card filing system of all of Conley's statements so that he could better track the lies and inconsistencies. He also noted that Conley had refused to have his picture taken before or during the trial. Smith believed he'd done this because someone had seen him in the back alley around the time Mary was killed, and without a photo to look at in the papers, they'd be unable to come forward and identify him. He noted his belief that Mary Fagan had not been killed in the metal room, but that she was in fact killed in the basement of the pencil factory. And based upon the timeline of events, this would have made it impossible for Leo Frank to be the killer. However, what I personally think is the most compelling piece of evidence Smith put forward was in regards to he and his wife's research on the handwriting and syntax of the murder notes. Now, hang with me here. This gets a little complicated, but hang with me. Smith and his wife compared the language of the murder notes to two other sources: the transcripts of what Conley had said on the witness stand and to the voluminous writings found in the Annie Maud Carter letters. You'll remember that Annie Maud Carter was Conley's jailhouse lover who he wrote lots of scandalous love letters to. There was something like 40 pages of Conley's handwriting in these letters. Smith and his wife, again using note cards, wrote down all the Conley statements and strung them around their house on twine, sort of like a laundry line. They did this for months, comparing the language of the murder notes to the language of the Annie Maud Carter letters to the words Conley used on the witness stand. They found dozens of similarities between all three, and I've got to be honest, it's pretty fascinating stuff. One example I'll give you is this. In one of the murder notes, the writer had used the expression make water. Make water as a euphemism for going to urinate. Sure enough, on page 1264 of the trial transcript, Jim Conley made a casual reference to having to go and make water on the day of the trial. William Smith made the point that that particular expression was unique to Southern black parlance. And a Northern Jewish Cornell grad, having just murdered a little girl, would never have thought to use that expression as he was dictating a murder note to Conley. This is just one example, but there are dozens of others like it. Needless to say, all of Atlanta was abuzz with the William Smith bombshell. Several more articles appeared in early October, and in each of them, William Smith clarified that his only motivation for coming forward with this new information was in the hope that it might help exonerate Leo Frank, a man he was now convinced was innocent. Throughout the fall of 1914, life dragged on in Cabbagetown's tent colony. Strikers slowly got their act together and created a primitive sanitation system, as well as a set of rules for those who lived there. The tent turned into a little community, eventually playing host to 2 weddings, a funeral, and multiple births. In the late fall, the camp was hit with heavy snow, a rare weather anomaly in the South. While things had gotten slightly better, life in the Union tent city was still anything but easy. And then, another big development. For reasons that are unclear, we know that in November of 1914, Harry Preston's cover as an inside agent of the mill was blown. Around that time, he was outed as a spy and run out of town. He would no longer be involved with the strike, though he and Oscar's paths would cross again later in life. In November, there was other big news that sent even more shockwaves of scandal through the encampment. Edgar Smith, Ola Delight's husband, had filed for divorce. Back then, divorce was a big social taboo, and many pointed to it as yet another sign of moral decay. In December, Ola's divorce trial was held in Atlanta, and Edgar's testimony against her was fairly damning. He claimed he came home one evening and caught his wife in bed with Pat Callahan. They were both drunk and, in his words, in a state of undress. So yeah, Ola Delight was caught shacking up with the guy who'd been stabbed, and that's what had incited Edgar to leave town. Edgar told the judge that Ola just generally wasn't a good wife and that she wouldn't, quote, stay at home where all good women ought to be, end quote. The judge presiding over the case ended up granting Edgar the divorce and ultimately sided with him, giving him the right to remarry, but not Ola. When the trial was finished, Ola Delight Smith was disgraced and devastated. Now exposed as an adulterer, whatever moral authority she had was utterly compromised in the eyes of both striking workers and outsiders already suspicious of the strike's supposedly moral foundations. In mid-December, Ola Delight Smith packed up her things and left Atlanta. Her time as a bold and passionate firebrand advocating for the working people of the South was over. It's now December of 1914, month number 48 in our story. You may remember this whole saga wraps up in month 56, and we only have 2 episodes left. But in the next episode, we're going to go the distance, and we're going to answer some burning questions. Will the discouraged and leaderless strikers of the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill find a way to rebound? Will they find a way to rally and defeat Oscar Elsas? And what about Leo Frank? Would he hang for killing Mary Fagan, or would he find a way to avoid the gallows? With his execution still scheduled for January, his legal team is getting desperate. The clock is ticking, and if these new revelations from William Smith are going to change anything, they had to move fast. In 1915, something will change in Atlanta. In 4 years, the Ripper had slaughtered his dozens. The mountaineers of Forsyth had gotten their blood. All of Atlanta cheered Leo Frank's death sentence, and Oscar Elsas was slowly choking the life out of the strike. But in 1915, a fresh wave of hate will infect Atlanta, in the air, in the papers, and even on the big screen. And when it finally arrives, Atlanta and America will never be the same. The explosive conclusion of our 56-month saga is right around the corner. That's next time on Catlick. Our Catlick walking tours are officially sold out. Our solo VIP tickets for the live finale are also sold out. All that's left for our live finale weekend is a couple of combo packages and some general admission tickets. We've already sold 200 tickets to the event, and the rest will be gone soon. Go pick yours up today, catlick.com, and be sure to check out my Instagram feed for some fresh pics of the brand new, just opened venue that will be hosting our live finale. By the way, you can find me on Instagram. I'm at BT_Harmon. That's Harmon with 2 A's. I can't wait to meet all of you in just a few short days. Get your tickets before they're gone at catlick.com. Catlick is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by Duciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. Catlick store manager, Brett Harmon. Special thanks to the staff at the Georgia Institute of Technology Library, Archives, and Special Collections. Special thanks also to author Gary Fink for his book, The Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill Strike of 1914 and 15, as well as Clifford Kuhn for his book, Contesting the New South Order, in regards to their work and research on the Fulton Bag Strike. Catlick Instagram Commenter of the Week, Garrett Davis. Catlick Instagram Story Star of the Week, at Mags Tyndall, who says, I got the hubs hooked and not mad at all about re-listening to Catlick Podcast. Catlick Twitter Follower of the Week, Leroy Lamar. When it comes to all things Cabbagetown, we've got some of the best visual content yet waiting for you inside the vault. Tons of old photos from the strike, the evictions, the tent city, plus great photos from Cabbagetown today. Be sure to subscribe to the vault at catlick.com. And finally, Catlick is independently written and produced by me, B.T. Harmon, signing off. And I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.